Special program on the Prime Minister's forthcoming visit to America, which starts tomorrow afternoon. That's when he leaves India. He then goes to Frankfurt and he reaches New York afternoon of Friday. Karan Thapar, let's come to the Prime Minister's economic agenda in America. When you look at the list of CEOs he's meeting for breakfast, the 6 that he's meeting for a special one-to-one, the reception that he's got with the India-US Business Council in Washington, and the smart city-oriented meetings with the mayor of New York as well as former Mayor Bloomberg, would you agree that it looks as if the economic agenda is much the most important part of the trip for the Prime Minister?
Yes, and it should be so. And I think the best part of this trip could be those one-on-one sessions with CEOs who will tell him how bad the situation is in doing business in India and how badly the retrospective taxes, the approvals.
Oh, we seem to be losing the line over there too. Let me bring you in very quickly on that point, Krishnan Srinivasan. Both the Economic Times and the Business Standard had front page lead stories today pointing out that Indian businessmen were not being taken by the Prime Minister as part of a delegation alongside him. In fact, the Economic Times points out also that the US-India CEO Forum won't be meeting. Now, has the Prime Minister erred by leaving Indian businessmen out, as those two pink papers were suggesting without formally stating? Or would you say that given that he's going to America and given that he needs American investment, he's right to concentrate and focus on American CEOs because he can meet the Indian ones whenever he wants at home? So is that criticism in the pink papers in India a bit mistaken?
Well, I think he's missed a trick by not taking Indian businessmen with him. That's certainly true. But at the same time, it's the Prime Minister who's projecting a certain message. This message isn't going to come from Indian business, it's going to come from the government. And I think your panelist who said earlier that it was the private sector businessmen who had to invest from the United States, and it's an opportunity for them to put across their difficulties in investing in India, which is going to be the most important thing.
You shook your head when Krishnan Srinivasan said that the Prime Minister had missed a trick by not taking Indian businessmen in his delegation. Were you agreeing or were you disagreeing?
I don't think it's very important to take the business community on any of these trips, but that's my point of view. But in this particular case, it's not a bilateral visit as such. So these delegations normally go when you're trying to concentrate on bilateral matters. This is a getting to know each other visit, and I don't think there's anything missed out on not taking it.
But I think, but CII is there in big strength, USIBC is there in big strength. So businessmen these days don't have to be carried in a delegation. Mr. Modi doesn't even carry journalists with him on a delegation.
So the grouse in the pink papers, if I read those articles correctly, they aren't formally complaining, but the fact that they put these stories on the front pages of the BS and the Economic Times suggests to me there's a grouse. That grouse you're saying is mistaken.
I think businessmen want to be seen in proximity of the Prime Minister, particularly a new powerful Prime Minister. And this is not a Prime Minister whose office you can call and fix time for yourself. So I think all of them would have liked that photo op.
Okay.
But they cannot pay for their passage, and I think they will get invites to the banquets and things.
Kamal Sibal, clearly the Prime Minister's pitch is going to be to American CEOs and is going to be come make in India. What are the chances that they will first want him to address concerns such as labor law and land acquisition before they're ready to respond to the request, come make in India?
Well, you know, in fact, we have lost enormous political ground also in the United States because the American corporate sector has turned its backs toward India for the reasons that you mentioned. So it's very important that he builds confidence with these people when he talks to them and indicates his roadmap to them. After that, of course, he has to perform and introduce the changes that he seeks. And the American companies and others will come in only when they see that the ground conditions are changing in India. But there is one big asset that the Prime Minister has, which is that he has some credibility in terms of his economic agenda. I think everybody is convinced that his goal is development. You know, all these things will help greatly in terms of changing the atmosphere. And I would like to add by saying one thing, that Indian CEOs have to give the lead in changing perceptions about India, because they have not been investing in India. Once they begin to invest in India, the international companies and the multinational corporations will take the lead. But so long as our CEOs feel that the ground conditions are not sufficiently attractive and they prefer to invest outside the country, then I'm afraid we would be not able to send the right message to the international business community. So Prime Minister Modi has acted on both fronts, the Indian front as well as the external front.
Krishnan Srinivasan, I want to spend a little time on this question of defense and FDI. It's an issue we briefly touched on in part one when we talked about whether the American government would put pressure from their side. Much more pressure will come on our Prime Minister when he meets with the CEOs who run major defense manufacturing companies in America and whose money he's looking for. One of the concerns they're bound to put to him is this: you have no problem as a government importing 100% foreign-made weaponry from abroad on which you have no control whatsoever, but you're not prepared to permit a joint venture which is even 51% to produce in India. And how does he account for that contradiction? When that question is put to him by companies that are interested in defense manufacture, what sort of answer can he give them? Or will he be a little embarrassed?
I think that the problem is that 49% is not likely to be very attractive to American entrepreneurs. The defense industry in America is in the private sector. They have to be convinced that the opportunities are there in India to come and to have some control over the production. And I think that 49% will not serve that purpose. On the other hand, I think Mr. Modi will have to tell them that it is very difficult to increase that amount in terms of the situation in India. He would have a great deal of difficulty in trying to raise that amount to 51 or further. It may be possible. He has a big majority in Parliament, but he would buy a lot of trouble and a lot of criticism if he tries to do that.
Let me put that very thought to you. You know, getting foreign manufacturers of defense to come to India and make here is critical because we spend so much on defense. Secondly, it's critical to creating employment. If Mr. Modi turns around and says, I find it impossible in my system to increase FDI from 49 to even 51, will they be convinced? Will an American manufacturer say, all right, I'm prepared to bring important technology that I control and lose control of it by giving it to a company that I don't control? I mean, will this work?
Look at the larger picture first. For Americans, India is an underperforming power. India is a power that hasn't quite lived up to its potential. Not for Americans. In fact, the global community sometimes looks at India as a country that keeps letting itself down. In fact, they see Turkey as a country that takes itself much more seriously in spite of its problems. But India doesn't. India tends to get caught into minor arguments, going back to the past. You know, the nonsense we created over the maid issue, maid in New York. We almost put our entire relationship with America at stake because of that. That's not the way mature, grown-up nations function. Now, having said that, it's very important tomorrow, what does Modi say on manufacturing? Because 49% is now a done deal. I think 51% can be done if you go to CCS for clearance, but 49% is a done deal. But give me half a minute. You've been trying to manufacture a main battle tank for 30 years now. If you had left it to the Indian private sector, even with 51% equity in Indian hands, they would have gone around the world, bought technology, bought the engine, everything that now DRDO or government manufacturers are buying, and you would have had 3,000 copies of that tank running with Indian Army and maybe 3,000 exported.
You're making an excellent reason for Mr. Modi to come back and say, I change, I'll go up to 51, maybe even 76.
No, but even if it doesn't do it, I'm saying even if it was only 49, say Mahindras or Tatas or Hindujas would have been making, look at the strength this country has in automotive manufacturing.
In other words, he should have done this earlier.
Yes, because a lot of the high technology things in weapon systems are actually modular systems. You can buy them and put them. You can buy a missile from outside and put it on your tank.
But the key point is, at the moment he's stuck with 49, can he convince Americans to come in at 49, or is he going to have to change?
You can have an Indian company build a very good tank, a brilliant world-class tank with 51% equity in Indian hands.
Okay.
But maybe some of the electronics, Maybe some of the missiles they'll have to buy from overseas.
Let me bring it, Rahul Kamar, because Rahul, this is something you've been exploring.
Systems are made these days.
And this is something that you've been talking to American CEOs about. How much pressure will Mr. Modi face from CEOs on this one issue? Because, by the way, to them, this is a bit like something that is inadequate, a half step, but not a sufficient step, and therefore not convincing. And will this be the sort of thing on which they'll say, maybe this government is not serious? Answer that, Rahul, before I go back to Shekhar.
The petrol pump owners who are Indian Americans who've so far been conflicted about India, have always rued about what's wrong with the India story. He is an icon. Modi is an icon for these Indian Americans. He epitomizes the equivalent of the American dream. A chai wala from a railway station becoming the Prime Minister. They look up to him as a rock star. He's trying to get
go back to FDI in defense, because it's FDI we're talking about. The motel owners are Indian expatriates who he's reaching out to, but they're not going to bring FDI to India. How much problem will he have with CEOs on that bigger, broader question of FDI limits?
As far as the big American defense companies are concerned, Karan, they are keen on this limit being pushed up to 49%. But the American government wants to move around this very carefully. They don't want to be seen to be putting overt pressure on Prime Minister Modi in his first visit itself to the United States. However, in his interactions, and he's calling a breakfast meeting at the Taj Palace Hotel, where several of these CEOs are coming in, they will be speaking to him behind closed doors and pressing upon the problems and regulation, how they want the caps to be increased. That will happen when the American CEOs speak to the Prime Minister, not so much when President Obama meets Prime Minister Modi.
Now, a bigger problem, some analysts say, and perhaps for American CEOs deeper, is the way they will look at long-term investments in India when they say to themselves, this is a country where commitments aren't kept. Today, for instance, the Supreme Court has scrapped 214 out of 218 coal licenses. A year ago, they scrapped 122 2G licenses. The government then retrospectively amended taxation. And the Modi government in July backed out of commitments to the WTO given by the previous government. All of this is raised for many analysts the concern, does India as a government, does India as a state stand by its commitments? How does Mr. Modi answer that concern? Because many CEOs will feel, if you change the rules of the game after we've come, why should we come at all?
Well, of course, that long-term question only time can answer, but the fact is, even if you were to bring about the reforms that are needed now, the question of how long they will be kept to and whether future governments may change them will be a handicap that has been inflicted on ourselves by what we've done till now.
How does Mr. Modi answer that concern?
Only by performance here back at home. There is no other answer.
Assurances alone won't work?
Well, who believes assurances beyond a point? They all have to see what's the situation on the ground. And as has been mentioned by somebody earlier today, it's not just the foreign investor. Our own investors have shied away from doing business here.
Krishnan Srinivasan, I want to put to you something that Gurcharan Das raised earlier, and sadly the line to Gurcharan Das is broken down, so we don't have him. You know, there's no doubt that the Prime Minister is a very persuasive person. But how effective can he be on his own, attracting investment to India through the power of persuasion? Or do you believe that the real benefit of the meetings he's going to have with American CEOs is that these meetings will impress upon him the need to push through the structural reforms that are needed and on which many people believe his government is dragging its feet? Is that the real benefit of these meetings, that he'll suddenly realize those reforms are necessary if I'm going to get the investment I want?
Well, I think that will be a very desirable outcome. But let's not forget that Mr. Modi enjoys a very fine reputation in business circles because of his time as Chief Minister in Gujarat. So he's been there, he's done that. He is well known in business circles as being business friendly. And I think his powers of persuasion are very great, and no doubt they'll be tested in America. But I think he will be able to come home with a certain number of assurances, at least from the major companies. Perhaps not in defense, but in other respects.
I've got Gurcharan Das.
But there are other problems, Karan.
Can I stop you? I'll come to other problems later. I've got Gurcharan Das back with us, and while I have him, I want to put that same question to him. Mr. Das, you were the one who suggested before the line broke that one great advantage of the meetings Mr. Modi is going to have with the CEOs is they will be able to impress upon him the need to push through the structural reforms if he wishes to invite American investors to come in with serious sums of money. Do you think that when he hears the problems they raise, whether it's to do with retrospective taxation, whether it's to do with bureaucracy, whether it's to do with FDI limits not being realistically raised, that he will realize that, you know, on a whole range of fronts, including difficult things like labor law and land acquisition, he has to push through those reforms. Otherwise, the money he wants, the investment he needs won't come. Do you think that's the great takeaway from him?
I think that would be the benefit to him. However, I think for the rest of the world, or for America, it's the opposite. I think that's why his timing of this trip is not very good. Because if our economy had moved up to about 6%, which it will in about a year's time, he would have a much stronger, he'll be speaking on a much stronger wicket. He'll have many more people interested in investing in India, because we still have to build up from a very real low, a low of trust, but low also of performance. And if once that happens, that's why, you know, I wish he would concentrate on fixing the problems of India rather than taking these trips abroad right now.
Shekhar Gupta, one big difference between the Chinese and the Japanese on the one hand and the Americans on the other is that Abe and Xi could commit their governments to investing 35 billion and 20 billion worth of investment. Obama can't and Obama won't. In the American case, the Prime Minister has to actually find a way of attracting American investors, the private sector. But if he succeeds, he can get much more than 55 billion from the Americans. Do you think the nature of the schedule he has and the focus he's putting on meeting investors suggests he understands this?
Well, he definitely understands this, but he's got problems. You know, I'm surprised you mentioned many things on which Government of India has gone back on the word of a previous government. Look at FDI in retail. Now, FDI retail was a government policy. All right, BJP was opposed to it, but it was put to vote in Parliament. To me, I think it's the first instance of something that was actually voted for in Parliament being reversed by the other party. I think to me, it's not found that much press, but it's almost akin to George Fernandez throwing out Coca-Cola and IBM, almost on a whim. So the world is a little bit worried about India. At the same time, let me also add, if we were talking about defense FDI, I was not defending the decision to keep it to 49%. I think to keep it to 49% is a nutty decision. Because then you are neither here nor there. But
Absolutely.
Having said that, now that you've done that, you have to move ahead from here. In politics, in diplomacy, there is no such thing as perfect timing.
Absolutely. Now, something else that is going to come up, Kamal Sibal, is in fact public political protest. It's already clear that the Alliance for Justice and Accountability has announced black flag protests in New York. Sikhs for Justice is planning what they call a citizens' court outside the White House, and then something called Coalition Against Genocide is determined to remind the Americans of what they claim is Mr. Modi's role in 2002. Could all of that unsettle Mr. Modi and throw him off his track, or do you think he's so used to it at home, he'll take it completely in his stride in America as well?
I think our side is anticipating this, and the conversations that I've had with officials here gave me the feeling that things are under control, and they are not fearing that this will go out of hand and start affecting the quality of the visit or be a big irritant in the relationship. Because there is this other American legislation relating to torts. Even if a foreign national commits a violation of treaties that US has signed, he can be actionable in US courts, because the US courts have given themselves this jurisdiction.
Okay.
And under this they try to give summons to Mrs. Gandhi and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and others. Now, if that sort of a thing were to happen, you know, it will be very unpleasant. That former ISI Director General Pasha was spared this because the Americans said that he enjoys diplomatic immunity. So I hope that the American administration would realize the sensitivity of this and control this and not allow it to go out of hand. But the fact is that around Obama, around the Democratic Party, there are a lot of human rights groups, and they have a lot of influence on the administration, and they'll try and do best to try and target the Prime Minister.
Very quickly, Rahul Kamal, because as you understand, time is our enemy. There is a certain concern in India that TV has gone completely over the top in the way they are covering the Modi visit. They've converted what is being called a spectacle into a tamasha. Will TV also show some of the protests against Mr. Modi when they happen, or do you think that shouldn't be shown?
No, absolutely. They must be shown. They're as much a part of the Modi story as the spectacle as well. And there's no reason at all why the protesters should be blacked out. In fact, they've registered with the NYPD. As you know well, Karan, you can't just hold a protest in New York. You need to seek permission from the police department. That permission has been granted. The organizers, in fact, are aware of this. And the organizing committee has reached out to Indian Americans to tell them that when you see these protesters, let them be. Let them make their voice heard. Do not get into any form of an altercation with the protesters, because that would make things worse. This is already being factored into Team Modi's game plan. This has already been factored into the organizers' game plan. And I think as journalists and editors, it is our responsibility to ensure that they get an opportunity to put forth their points of view as much as we cover everything else that happens. It will be a side story. Modi is used to protest. It happened during the Sadbhavna fast in Gandhinagar as well. It will happen here, but it will not take away from the big spectacle. But of course, it's something that should and must be covered, Karan.
Thank you, Rahul, and my thanks also to all my other guests for joining me. Clearly, this is a subject that we will be covering extensively in the days ahead.